It's summer 1907, and off the coast of Scotland, a brand new luxury liner ploughs its way through the gentle sea. This ship is a revolutionary step forward, the largest liner yet built in Britain by far. For 2 years, an army of workers has toiled long and hard to fill the cavernous hull with the finest luxuries ever seen at sea. Now, she's on her builder's trials in the Firth of Clyde. It's an important day. The ship is the biggest, yes, but she also has to be the fastest. Every part of her being has been constructed with speed in mind. If she can't hit 24 knots, then her builders will be penalised and the ship might prove an embarrassment. Representatives of the owners, the builders, and the Admiralty all gather on the bridge, and the wind rips at their bowler hats as the speed picks up. Now, she's moving all ahead full, her 4 propellers tearing through the ocean with furious intent. Like a long, thin knife, the liner cuts her way through the waves with ease. 20 knots, 21, 22. Can she hit the target? The men collectively hold their breaths and wait. Lusitania was the modern marvel of her time, an engineering wonder that combined all of the lessons learnt from decades of hard work and ingenuity. She became a household name for her beauty and her grace, and she carried tens of thousands in comfort and happiness across one of the world's largest oceans. But Lusitania would not be remembered for her luxury or her revolutionary design. Instead, this great ship's career would be virtually forgotten and overshadowed instead by horrific tragedy. In 1915, worlds collided when Lusitania, the marvel of her era, met another technological wonder that would change the course of history: the submarine. A series of unfortunate events would lead to a chance encounter that would leave hundreds dead, and one of the world's finest ships reduced to a rusting pile of wreckage on the sea floor. But how Lusitania came to be, and the path that led to her destruction, is one of the most incredible tales in modern history. That bright day in June 1907 saw Lusitania at her best, brand new and raring to show what she could do. Her turbine engines roared, the bow wave glowed white at her waterline. 22 knots, 23, could she make the speed record? Lusitania sped on ahead and into the history books. May 1st, 1915, New York City, on a busy Saturday. The air hums with life. At Brush Stadium, the Yankees are demolishing the Philadelphia Athletics. Cars choke the city streets. Chauffeurs and taxi drivers drop off their passengers at the docks for a waiting steamer. In the New York Times, on page 19, after the stock reports and the real estate notices, varsity football news and baseball scores, readers could find the outgoing and incoming steamships, their destinations, and times of sailing. Individual lines posted advertisements, the big names like White Star Line, but sandwiched in between notices for the Anchor Line and the new Stockbridge Hotel was a conspicuous warning. Notice, it read. Travellers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies, and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travellers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. It's an obviously ominous message, and just a few lines above it could be found, printed in block letters, the name Lusitania, because she was due to steam out of New York Harbour that very day. Early in the morning that Saturday, Lusitania sat moored at Cunard Line's Pier 54, a steady stream of passengers boarding from gangways and finding their staterooms on board. Lusitania was going to steam her way through a war zone, and this was not one of Lusitania's normal sailings. Her captain was quizzed by newsmen on his confidence in being able to outrun his enemy. The newspaper notices had roused a huge amount of angst. Never mind, he had said, Lusitania could outrun any submarine. But his confidence couldn't shake the pall of concern that hung over the Chelsea piers that morning as passengers swarmed the decks to wave their final goodbyes and the Lusitania's whistles boomed out through the harbour. Some worried that this would be the great ship's last ever sight of New York. And they were right. Within the week, 3 in 5 of the beaming faces that lined Lusitania's railings would smile no more. But what ended as a tragedy had begun years earlier as a monumental triumph, and this berth at New York had been the scene of many a joyous homecoming, because there had once been a time when Lusitania was the finest ship in the world. In 1848, a curious-looking ship chugged its way into New York Harbour for the first time. Aptly named America, the ship carried a distinctive, tall, red smokestack with thin black bands, the telltale paint scheme of a shipping company that would one day become an empire. Samuel Cunard had founded his line in 1840 with ships that ran initially between Liverpool, Halifax, and Boston, and a few years later had come to dominate the transatlantic passenger trade. Mail contracts and government subsidies meant making a line between Liverpool and New York was a profitable venture for the company. The result was a quartet of purpose-built paddle ships, America as the class leader, and regular sailings into New York Harbour. It was the start of a relationship between Cunard Line and New York City that lasts to this day. But as the 1850s and 1860s wore on, competition emerged. Fierce competition. The White Star Line, the Inman Line, Germany's North German Lloyd, they all began to compete with Cunard, and it sparked the equivalent of an arms race, as every few years each line tried to outdo the others by introducing the biggest, fastest, and most luxurious ship. It was a game of tit for tat that would last well into the 20th century. Cunard had plenty of wins in this contest, but in 1897, Germany shocked the shipping world almost into stunned silence. North German Lloyd's SS Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse was the world's first so-called superliner. Distinctively, she carried 4 enormous, tall funnels. Almost overnight, virtually every other liner in the world looked second best by comparison. Now, this wasn't just a fun contest anymore. National pride was tied up in the development of these ships. They became floating billboards for their home nations, underscoring the development of the Oceanliner, a beautiful symbol of peace and prosperity had been the ugly development of weapons of war, torpedo boats, submarines, and mighty battleships. The major nations of the world stockpiled immense quantities of weapons never before properly used on the battlefield, machine guns, field artillery. It seemed inevitable that there would be a boiling point reached someday soon, but most hoped that cooler heads would prevail. Cunard Line's fleet was, in the early 1900s, being completely overshadowed by the German companies, particularly North German Lloyd, who followed up on their success with a trio of impressive sister ships for the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse. For Cunard, this was a serious business threat. For Britain itself, it simply would not do. The British Admiralty knew they needed a horse in the race. Ships capable of great speed, that were the size of the German liners, had obvious military potential, but there was a problem. The White Star Line, originally a British company, had been bought by an American conglomerate. It left only one serious transatlantic player in British control, one horse in the race that the Admiralty could back to answer the German threat: Cunard Line. Cunard's chairman, Lord Inverclyde, was nothing if not a shrewd businessman. After taking over from his father, and over the course of 4 decades, he had successfully navigated the company into the modern era of shipbuilding, Now, with both his country's and his company's reputations at stake, he turned to the British government, appealing for investment towards a pair of liners that could outperform anything else afloat. The old agreements with the Admiralty ran deep with Cunard. The government naturally agreed, but under one condition. These proposed ships needed to be built to Admiralty specifications so that they could easily be repurposed into warships in the event of the outbreak of war. Inverclyde agreed, and history was about to be made. Under the agreement, Cunard was offered a vast loan and a yearly subsidy if the liners could maintain a maximum average speed of 24.5 knots and a minimum of 23.5. Just hitting those speeds wouldn't do. They needed to be easily maintained. As passenger-carrying ocean liners, it would make them the fastest ships in the world by far, but this would serve a vital role in a potential war effort. The simple installation of guns could transform these speed queens into vicious hunters, extremely difficult to catch. The papers were signed, and so it was that two of history's most famous and glamorous peacetime liners were designed with a secret purpose and war in mind. Work officially began on hull number 367 on June 16, 1904, when her keel was laid down at the John Brown & Co. shipyard in Scotland. When construction officially got underway, it was clear that almost every aspect of the ship's design could be summed up in one word: unprecedented. Immediate adjustments needed to be made within the shipyard to accommodate the liner's immensity. The slipway used for the ship's construction was the size of two smaller slipways from the previous generation combined. Adding to this was another unusual conundrum for engineers. The ship's 787-foot, 240-metre length was greater than the width of the River Clyde, where the shipyard was actually located, meaning she'd need to be launched diagonally, using the additional length afforded by a nearby tributary. Overseen by legendary naval architect Leonard Pesquet, engineers began to map out a ship with aggressively fine lines. Hitting and maintaining those required speeds was a tall order. The ship would need to prioritise speed above all else. Her plans show it. The hull was long and extremely fine, like a chisel. Pesquet's design teams tested models in an Admiralty tank and refined the stability. This was cutting-edge technology for the day. The ship's straight, plumb bow would mean the liner would cut its way through the worst of the Atlantic's towering waves, but the radical hull form would be useless without a suitably powerful engine to drive it forward. And fortunately, John Brown and the Cunard line had just the thing for it. The miracle machine was the Parsons turbine, an innovation in engine design that could easily outperform the older style of triple expansion steam engines that was popular at the time. Steam rushed through under pressure to turn a giant rotor and the ship's propellers. The new liner would have 4 main turbines, giving her a brute force of some 60 to 70,000 horsepower. It would need almost an unthinkable amount of steam to feed the turbines. 25 fire tube boilers lined the ship's bottom, fed by hand by hundreds of stokers who would need to shovel tons of coal around the clock to keep the ship roaring ahead. But the exact layout of this machinery, and how all those hundreds of tons of massive steel and iron equipment could even fit inside such a fine hull, was still being decided on. And not only that, but the Admiralty had their own ideas of how things should be arranged below the waterline. When constructing liners, it was typical for work on the hull to begin at both ends and then eventually meet in the middle. But in Lusitania's case, all work began at the bow. It left more time for the ship's engineers and machine workers to fine-tune the power plant that would be loaded into the ship's hull and would ultimately be responsible for her cracking speeds. The design process took 2 long years. In 1902, Pesquet's original concept showed a sleek ship with 3 enormous funnels, but by the time the power plant had been chosen, it was clear that more boilers were needed. More boilers meant another smokestack to clear the smoke. Yard number 367 would be a 4-funneled ship. On a clear, bright June day in 1906, after months of construction, the ship was at last ready for her launch. The sun beat down on her gleaming nameplate. There it spelt out Lusitania. It wasn't every day that the world's largest ocean liner took to the water for the first time, and almost every employee of John Brown & Co.'s shipyard was given the day off for the event, and passes were handed out to friends and family. Towering over their heads rose the bow of the largest ship ever built, seemingly touching the sky in its immensity. Lord Inverclyde had died before Lusitania's design could really get off the ground, but his wife, Lady Inverclyde, was there that day to launch the ship. With a crash, a bottle of champagne detonated against the steel-plated bow, and as a band performed Rule Britannia, Lusitania rumbled down the slipway which had been coated in tons of tallow and grease to ease her in. To the sounds of cheers and whistles, the hull floated for the very first time, a monument to engineering and human achievement. Now came the task of turning this empty hull into a working, living ship. 6 tugs came alongside Lusitania and towed her a few hundred feet down the Clyde River to her fitting out berth, where she would receive the bulk of the interior fixtures and furnishings that would rival most hotels on land, and the immensely powerful machinery that would make her the fastest ship on the ocean. For months, workers toiled, artisans carved, and labourers carted intricately detailed panels, and slowly the bare steel interior was clad with the finest decoration available. Electricians installed miles and miles of wiring, thousands of globes, call buttons, lifts, and motors. The immense boilers, the monstrous turbines, they were all lifted and sealed into the ship like the internal organs of some giant sea creature. Riveted on top were 4 towering smokestacks, each about as tall as most office buildings in New York City. With construction and fitting out complete, the ship would now need to undergo her sea trials. Lusitania was a unique case though. As Cunard's crown jewel, it was vital that all went according to plan. Any less than the best would be a serious blow to reputation. To account for this, the ship's first sea trials were actually performed somewhat in secret, so that if any problem arose, the ship's owners could make adjustments without attracting negative attention from the public and the press. On July 27, 1906, Lusitania made steam and surged ahead under her own power for the very first time. Joining the ship's crew were representatives from the shipyard, Cunard Line, the Board of Trade, and the British Admiralty. Both Cunard's reputation and British national pride were at stake, and the deal struck between Cunard and the Admiralty added an extra layer of pressure. If the liner did not meet her required speed of 24.5 knots as set by the Admiralty, the shipyard would face a penalty of £10,000 for every 1/10 of a knot below requirement, up to a total of £100,000, or $15 million in today's money. Slowly, the engines were worked up, the stokers poured the coal into the furnaces, and the turbines rumbled as all 4 propellers churned the water into violent white turmoil. 20 knots, then 21, 22, 23, 24.5 knots. Lusitania had done it. With the nimbleness of a steam yacht, she slipped through the water triumphantly, as if her 44,000-ton weight were a mere trifle. She had exceeded all expectations. Cunard and John Brown breathed a collective sigh of relief. But it wouldn't be all good news. The ship's powerful machinery and the arrangement of her propellers created a much dreaded problem. Interference between the wakes of the different sets of propellers was causing a shocking vibration which resonated with the stern and reverberated through the hull. It was passed directly into the passenger accommodations at the stern, a rattling so fierce that it clearly rendered the affected spaces, mostly second and third class accommodations, to be virtually unusable. Having been spared serious public scrutiny as a result of the trial's relative secrecy, Lusitania found herself at the Canada dry dock, where workers tried to address the problem. The fine, towering second-class dining saloon was ripped out and rebuilt with new bracing. Where there had previously been open space, columns now pierced the decks. The decor was reinstalled, and by the time the rebuild was completed, the rattling had diminished somewhat, but it would never be fully resolved. Lusitania would suffer from the issue for the rest of her career. Such was the price of technological innovation. On September 7th, 1907, after the initial trials were completed and after a short test voyage around Ireland, nearly 250,000 people lined the Mersey as the ship arrived at her home port, Liverpool, for the very first time. Tied up alongside, she absolutely dwarfed the landing stage, taking up the space 3 regularly sized steamers normally might. Under cover of darkness, Lusitania cast off from the landing stage at 9 p.m, bound for Queenstown, Ireland, and then the open ocean. Aboard her were around 2,200 people. The paint still smelled fresh, and much of the ornate crockery and cutlery had never yet served a meal. With a boom, Lusitania's voice echoed around Liverpool's skyline, and thousands of voices cried out in joy as she set off on her maiden voyage. Lusitania was finally going to do the job she'd been designed to do. Lusitania's first commander was Captain James B. Watt, and as he gazed down at his ship's mighty bows crashing through the waves, he must have been filled with an immense sense of pride. The ship's first stop had been Queenstown, Ireland, before she'd made a southwesterly course for the New World. Lusitania steamed lithely through the ocean, and she was proving to be every inch the speed demon she'd been cracked up to be. Approaching New York, the ship had steamed straight past the bewildered White Star liner Celtic, which had set off 2 days before her from Liverpool. Aboard the ship, passengers on the Maiden Voyage were immersed in a world of comfort and luxury few before had experienced. One look at Lusitania's sumptuous interiors, and you could see how she became an instant favourite, especially among society's elite. There was no shortage of luxury to be found on board, and it was very modern, from electric lighting throughout, as well as electric lifts, a clever form of air conditioning and heating by way of thermotanks, and the newest and finest in Marconi wireless telegraphy. Lusitania was truly a ship for a new age. Towering public rooms and entrances gave the ship a light and airy feeling. First class was naturally the most opulent and celebrated. The lavishly designed accommodations were the work of Scottish interior designer James Miller. They could be best described as palatial, a spectacle of airy plasterwork, high ceilings, and stunning stained glass. The Louis XVI style dining saloon could seat 470 passengers between its 2-story structure and was topped with an enormous dome that was adorned with decorative frescoes and hand-carved mouldings. The well-appointed lounge and music room was the most popular gathering spot for first class, and its breathtaking mahogany detailing, rich green carpet, and massive, 20-foot-high barrel-vaulted skylight crowned the room. It was made up of 12 different stained glass panels, each artfully depicting a different month of the year. At either end lay two magnificent green marble fireplaces, each 14 feet high. The room was especially attractive to female passengers who were known to pass the time on board with their noses firmly in a book, or excitedly writing letters and postcards home to friends and family. It also functioned as a well-stocked library where passengers could check out books for the duration of the voyage. Further aft, the first-class smoking room was a space tailored to the men on board, with darker, richer wood panelling and furnishings setting it in sharp contrast to the light and airy feel of the rest of the ship. Like other spaces, the smoking room was topped with a massive barrel-vaulted stained glass ceiling that served to brighten and open the room up. To help passengers get through the ship more comfortably, designers were faced with a problem. Sprawling, magnificent staircases had long been the norm on ships, and that worked fine if your vessel was only a few decks high, but liners like Lusitania towered 10 stories above the waterline. Electric passenger lifts fitted inside glass-encased, wrought iron cages ran up and down to ferry the passengers where they needed to go, another feature that marked Lusitania out as a ship of the future. For those looking to get some sun, located further aft on the boat deck, the Veranda Cafe, a room open at one end, was filled with light wicker furniture and palms with a skylight above. For those enjoying light refreshments inside, it was something like sitting on a veranda in the French Riviera. Of course, the luxury of the public rooms carried over into the passengers' accommodations. First class itself was almost segregated by the variety and sizes of the cabins available. Some were way down in the ship's hull, but at the top of the list, and for the small sum of just around $100,000 per crossing in today's money, first-class passengers travelling on Lusitania could be treated to one of the regal suites that came complete with 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a dining room, a private bathroom, a lavatory, and a pantry. This was Edwardian opulence at its most obscene. Second class on Lusitania was probably where the ship shined most in the market, because truly, to travel in second class aboard this ship was as good as travelling first class on any other liner. And it wasn't just hyperbole or exaggeration. Second class got its own towering dining saloon and palatial lounges. It had been a clever, calculated decision by Cunard. Instead of relying on the shipyard alone, they had broken with protocol by appointing the ship's interior designer, James Miller, to advise on how best to design second class as well. What resulted was a series of spacious, comfortable public spaces decorated in the same Georgian and Louis XVI styles that could be found in their first-class counterparts. Rich mahogany, airy plaster detailing, it was all on display here, offering a feeling of luxury unlike any other second-class space at sea. Unfortunately, as we know, these spaces suffered from a fatal flaw: vibration. The fix supplied by the shipyard saw many stabilizing beams and archways installed to reduce the vibrations, which the builders and designers tastefully disguised with wood paneling and gilt trim. In third class, passengers were treated to luxury akin to second class on other liners. Dining, smoking, and general rooms featured timber paneling. This in an era where most ships housed steerage in simple, white-painted steel compartments with exposed piping. Most impressively to passengers on board were flushing toilets. For many migrants, this would be their first encounter with such a novelty. So too with electric lights in all cabins. It's the kind of thing we take for granted today, but the simple presence of those features marked Lusitania out as a true wonder of her age. For a few halcyon days in that September crossing, passengers chatted happily, ate heartily, and relaxed as their fine ship sliced through the Atlantic at a breakneck clip. With New York fast approaching, whispers began to spread on board of the possibility of a record-breaking crossing on Lusitania's first try. Her speed had steadily increased each day throughout the journey, in the hopes of steaming into New York quickly enough to clinch the record for Britain once again from Germany, but it was not to be. The truth was that Watt had no intention of breaking the record that voyage. He had wanted to work his ship's engines up first. Even so, Lusitania missed breaking the German speed record by just 30 minutes. That was enough to make the North German Lloyd Line sweat. As Lusitania steamed past the Statue of Liberty for the first time, she was met with a welcoming committee of 200 vessels waiting to escort her to her berth. A massive flag bearing a message of welcome hung from the Singer building. Sirens were sounded, guns were fired into the air, and hundreds of thousands of onlookers crowded the piers. On her march to her berth, she slowly and gradually lowered her blue ensign as acknowledgement of the warm welcome she had been given. Despite the disappointment that the ship had failed to capture the speed record, Cunard officials assured the public that it was simply a matter of time. On her second voyage, Lusitania would prove herself in spades. She became the first liner to ever complete a transatlantic crossing in under 5 days, and she reclaimed the speed record for Great Britain. There was much celebration that evening in Lusitania's first-class dining room, with the ship's purser, Joseph Lancaster, offering a jaunty limerick which ran, "There was a young man in Westphalia who had charge of much costly regalia. To his sweetheart he said, 'My dear, when we're wed, we'll call our first girl Lusitania.'" North German Lloyd, on the other hand, was none too happy about this turn of events, jealously noting in the press that the Kaiser Wilhelm the Grosse had logged more miles on their crossings than Lusitania had on her maiden voyage, and that Lusitania had not exceeded the daily speed average of the German vessel. But she had broken the record that mattered, having made the crossing in an unheard of 4 days, 19 hours, and 52 minutes. Overnight, she became a household name, and the pride of her home nation, but more importantly than that, she was a happy ship. The golden years of Lusitania's career had begun. Lusitania's career was not without its eventful moments. Early on, the electrical fittings, such a wonder though they were, proved extremely troublesome, with bulbs blowing regularly and circuits shorting. The extreme fineness of the liner's hull also made for some curious behaviour. She was known to suddenly and alarmingly drop underfoot in even relatively calm seas, which could send unready passengers or stewards sprawling. Just 2 months after her maiden voyage, in late 1907, her semi-sister ship, Mauretania, joined her on the Liverpool to New York run. Both ships had been built by rival shipping firms to feed and benefit from the competitive spirit. They looked similar from the outside, but on the inside, where Lusitania was light, airy and elegant, Mauretania was dark, cozy and more classic. More importantly though, the new ship was fast. Mauretania beat Lusitania's speed record. Lusitania tried again in 1909 to wrest the title back from her sister when she had her original 3-bladed propellers replaced with new, more modern 4-bladed screws. She won the record back, but Mauretania beat her once again shortly after, and held the record for another 20 years. The real winner of this interfleet rivalry was Cunard, who could proudly boast the world's 2 largest and fastest liners. The towering red funnels of the ships became a regular and welcome sight in New York City, and in 1910 a massive new series of piers and sheds was built to help service the influx of enormous new liners. New York's iconic Chelsea piers were finished, and the Cunard ships at last had a terminal that matched their modernity. Then, in the winter of 1910, Lusitania was almost lost. A storm had battered the US East Coast, and it had proved fatal. Snowfall caused havoc, and the Atlantic was at its absolute worst. Less than 50 years prior, any ship caught in those conditions would be fighting for its very life, but Lusitania cut through the waves with relative ease, although even her famous speed had to be curtailed to do it. The ship had been built tough, with decades of modern maritime engineering expertise behind her, and she pressed on through the angry seas, with waves cresting over her deck and her superstructure with a thunderous din that was reminiscent of gunfire. Captain William Turner had slowed his ship down to around 16 knots in order to carefully traverse the storm, and the liner was handling herself adeptly, gracefully cresting wave after wave as they rolled towards her. But on this particular night, the ocean was looking to unleash its true fury. As Lusitania rode over the crest of one wave, her bow dipped down toward the water, just as a veritable wall of water some 70 or 80 feet high rose from the sea in front of her, blocking out even the sky. There was no avoiding it. It came crashing down onto the vessel with unimaginable force. Water violently washed over the decks down the entire length of the ship, burying her bow and superstructure beneath the surface. The crew stationed in the wheelhouse were were thrown against bulkheads, and the ship's wheel was actually ripped from the telemotor and hurled across the room, along with the quartermasters who were still holding onto it. Above their heads, on the compass platform above the bridge at the very top of the superstructure, a seaman was alarmed to find the enormous ship beneath his feet simply disappear into the ocean as white water swirled around his knees. Lusitania wasn't done though. She zoomed up out of the water with force, and she regained her trim. She had survived a brush with an extremely rare rogue wave. It hadn't been pretty. Lifeboats were smashed against the deck, or torn off entirely, and the front of the bridge had been crushed by the force of the water, crumpling it back several inches. The bridge windows, nearly an inch thick, were all smashed. Davits were twisted like tin foil, doors were broken, bulkheads in the steward's quarters were bent. It took 15 minutes for the lights on board to be restored, and another 40 minutes before the ship could once again get underway. Miraculously, Lusitania survived this violent pummeling and was able to carefully navigate her way toward New York, battered and bruised, but ultimately still in good health. Her arrival, with bridge windows smashed and boarded up, run front page on New York's newspapers. The celebrity liner seemed to have cheated death, but sadly, time would soon show that she had merely delayed it. Life for Lusitania and her sister ship carried on with a regular happy routine, but then, in 1911, there came the long-anticipated answer from Cunard's old rivals. Olympic was put into service by the White Star Line that summer for her inaugural season. She dwarfed even the Lusitania. The Cunard sisters could no longer boast to be the largest pair of liners at sea because Olympic was going to get a sister ship soon as well. Lusitania was just departing when Olympic first docked in New York in 1911, and in an act of unusual bad faith, her commander didn't recognise Olympic, and Lusitania's whistles weren't sounded, nor were her flags lowered in salute. She simply left in jealous silence. The following years would prove more lively for the Cunard Greyhound. In early 1912, the schedule was changed for Lusitania and her sister. They would begin departing New York hours earlier than normal at 1 a.m, with Mauretania sailing on Mondays and Lusitania on Wednesdays. It would give passengers bound for Ireland plenty of time to disembark at Fishguard in Wales, where they could hop a ferry home, and then Lusitania could land her passengers at a reasonable hour in Liverpool. This was at the behest of the Irish Parliament, after Cunard had halted stops in Ireland during return trips. Eastbound, she still wouldn't call it Ireland, but at least this was a good compromise. Leaving at 1 a.m. might have seemed like a strange choice, but it proved surprisingly popular. The New York Times happily reported, in full sincerity, that it gave passengers time enough to attend the theatre beforehand. They stepped aboard about 11 p.m, still dressed in their theatre clothes. From then, until 1914, the 1 a.m. departure became Lusitania's routine. Then, in April of 1912, there came a monumental shock. Olympic's anticipated sister ship, Titanic, was introduced and lost on her maiden voyage. It was a huge blow to the transatlantic passenger trade as a whole. The scandal had been that Titanic should ever be allowed to go to sea with not nearly enough lifeboats for all on board. But the truth was that virtually all large passenger ships did the same. Lusitania was loaded with a small flotilla of lifeboats and collapsibles that would eventually provide space for 2,600 people. And then, in mid-1913, the ship began to experience problems with her vaunted turbines that resulted in her being pulled from service and refitted. By then, Lusitania wasn't the largest ship, nor the fastest ship in the world anymore, but she was arguably the most lovely. Her interiors still appealed. The wealthy and the well-travelled, they all flocked to her, and she and Mauretania did so well for Cunard that a third ship, Aquitania, was laid down for introduction in 1914. It all seemed to be going so well. But then, almost overnight, everything changed. The year Aquitania entered service, the tensions that had long been building between Britain, France, and Germany began to heighten. The boiling point was at last reached. On Sunday, August 2nd, 1914, Lusitania departed New York bound for Liverpool on her usual return home, but this would prove to be anything but a usual voyage. She left under a pall of uncertainty. The Austrian Archduke had been assassinated the week prior. Germany seemed poised to invade France at any moment in support of its allies. Diplomats frantically negotiated, and the newspapers and telegraphs ran with the latest news. Lusitania would need to make her usual scheduled crossing regardless of the outcome. 2 days into her voyage, alarming news finally came through on the ship's wireless set. It had happened. Britain had declared war on Germany. Lusitania was now a trophy to be hunted. Her passengers woke to find their ship being transformed. The gorgeous Cunard red funnels had been painted over in a dark grey, so too her brilliant white superstructure. Cunard, with its close Admiralty ties, had suspected that war was likely to break out on this voyage. They'd loaded her with stocks of grey paint just in case. The vessel was disguised so that she could blend into the Atlantic and make good her escape. The greyed-out Lusitania arrived in Liverpool a few days later, a bizarre sight given how drab she looked, but as it would happen, a few cans of grey paint were not the only preparations Cunard and the Admiralty had made for Lusitania in wartime, because the ship beneath the passengers' feet had a series of secret features which might have shocked them had they known. Admiralty involvement in Lusitania's design had been heavy from the start when they held the hull model tests at their tank, but then it manifested in other forms as well. Of course, the ship was designed to be very fast thanks to her turbines and her hull shape, but that wasn't all. Everything below the waterline had to be designed with warfare in mind. The Admiralty's grand plan was actually to convert ships like Lusitania and Mauretania into armed merchant cruisers, warships with guns designed to engage other cruisers or enemy merchant ships. Lusitania had been designed to actually engage enemy vessels in combat from the very beginning. The most obvious evidence of this can be found on her original deck plans. Obvious locations for 6-inch guns were marked out around the decks, and the mounting points for those guns were actually installed. Beyond that, though, was the ship's hull itself. Every consideration had been given to what might happen if Lusitania found herself in a gunfight with another ship. Her mechanical heart had to be protected at all costs. The Admiralty had stipulated that transverse coal bunkers had to run the length of the hull and provide a shield to the crucial boilers. Meanwhile, every major piece of machinery was to be housed well below the waterline where it might be protected from small caliber shellfire. The balanced rudder was designed to Navy standard. It impacted the shape of Lusitania's stern, which more resembled that of a cruiser or battleship. But crucially, the steering engine room with its emergency steering platform, complete with ship's helm and compass binnacle, was also located partly below the waterline. On many other ships of the era, the steering engines were often mounted much higher up. If Lusitania's bridge was shot away, the ship could be steered and operated almost entirely from this special compartment protected from enemy shells. This would be unlike any war the British Admiralty had ever fought, because they were facing, for the first time ever, a new and deadly foe. Germany had invested heavily in submarine technology. Their fleets of U-boats were well commanded and crewed and deadly efficient. At first, Britain seemed rather unconcerned by these newfangled machines, but this would soon change. On September 22nd, 1914, the German U-9 torpedoed and sank 3 British warships in one morning for the cost of hundreds of lives. This forced the British to recognise the U-boat for the existential threat that it truly was. If Germany could sink enough ships, Britain would starve. The outbreak of the Great War had unleashed hell upon Europe. Almost overnight, the passenger trade across the Atlantic ceased. The great liners of the world were mothballed while their owners waited to see what would happen next, and then, one by one, old agreements with the Admiralty began to be enacted, and ships were called up for service. Somewhat ironically, even though Lusitania and Mauretania had been designed with the conflict in mind, their immensely coal-hungry power plant kept the Admiralty from calling on them for service as armed merchant cruisers. They just consumed far too much coal, almost 900 tons of the stuff every day. The delay in calling the ships up for service was fortuitous because, in practice, liners actually made for terrible armed merchant cruisers. They were damaged and sunk in alarming numbers. The Cunard Carmania accidentally stumbled across the German liner Cap Trafalgar, which had been disguised, of all ships on the ocean, as the Carmania. Even though she was just fighting another ocean liner, Carmania was badly damaged in the conflict and almost sunk. The Admiralty had other plans for Lusitania. Instead of going into service as a warship, it was vital that a sea link between Great Britain and America still be maintained. Important diplomats and figures could get across the Atlantic in less than a week aboard the legendary Cunard ship. Speed was, after all, her most valuable asset. But crippling coal shortages meant there had to be concessions. Her average speed was reduced from 26 knots to around 21, which was still an impressive enough clip and quick enough to outrun any U-boat. At the time, no vessel making more than 14 knots had ever been successfully sunk by a submarine. On the morning of February 4th, 1915, another alarming message arrived aboard Lusitania while she was mid-ocean. Germany had enacted a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. It meant that Germany had declared a war zone off the coast of Britain and Ireland. With the passing of this declaration, any British ship, be it merchant, passenger or otherwise, was considered a justified target of war. On Lusitania's bridge was Captain Daniel Dow, a Cunard veteran of some 4 decades. He took Germany's threats very seriously. The night before the ship arrived in Liverpool, Dow stayed on the bridge throughout the night, keeping a close watch for surface submarines and concocting a plan to hopefully keep his ship and her passengers safe from attack. He reasoned that as long as a torpedo did not cause an explosion in the boilers, Lusitania should live for about an hour after being hit. With this time frame in mind, he drew up a detailed plan to ensure all passengers could be safely carried off the ship in her lifeboats before she foundered. Dow also made the decision to fly the American flag, a flag of neutrality, on Lusitania's masthead during the final day of her voyage, a move which would prove very controversial and carry serious implications for the conventions of naval warfare. If Dow's strategy was to pass Lusitania off as an American ship, it probably would not have been very effective since Lusitania was one of the most recognizable vessels afloat, and America had no 4 funneled liners of her own. Regardless, when the ship docked, the Liverpool landing stage erupted with reporters eager to know the reasoning behind the usage of this kind of false flag. Captain Dow assured the press that there was no subterfuge intended. He was merely signaling the presence of neutral American passengers crossing on his vessel. An American journalist reporting on the whole affair, though, wrote that Britannia not only ruled the waves, but also waived the rules. After the false flag incident in Liverpool, Dow completed one last crossing on Lusitania before stepping down as the ship's master. He was no longer able to justify the stress of operating a ship that had been marked as a justified target of war in an enemy war zone while likely transporting contraband across the Atlantic. Dow had spent 5 wartime voyages commanding Lusitania, and on each one he was known to scarcely leave the bridge, hardly eating or sleeping, keeping a constant watch for submarines. Eventually, he developed stomach ulcers thanks to the stress and the lack of proper nourishment. Cunard approved his request for sick leave, and command of Lusitania was handed back over to Captain William Turner. Meanwhile, Captain Dow's actions had caused a ripple effect that found its way to a very unamused Germany. The Germans, of course, had not taken kindly to Britain's clever loophole. Members of the press insisted that a British ship flying the flag of a neutral country should be illegal, and that the practice left no way for German U-boats to discern between neutral and non-neutral ships. On the war front, the Imperial German Navy gradually continued upping the ante over the months that followed in response to what they saw as Britain's attempt to skirt the conventions of war. By the May of 1915, the gloves were off. Germany now had its sights directly on British passenger vessels, and they were very clear about their intentions. Previously, a submarine would engage an enemy merchant ship by first surfacing, forcing it to stop, surrender, and evacuate before then sinking it in an orderly fashion. The U-boat crews had been horrified when their prey began to fight back, sometimes with guns and even with attempts at ramming. Lusitania's false flag may have been one of the final straws. Now German U-boats could attack unseen at any time from below the surface. The German ambassador to America, Johann Heinrich von Bernstorff, had personally decided that his home nation's submarine campaign was, in his opinion, probably illegal, and actually doing damage to Germany's reputation and relations with the USA. He didn't think Lusitania could be targeted. To do so would be an obvious diplomatic misstep of enormous proportions, but even so, he decided to act. A warning was drafted and sent from the German embassy in Washington to the major newspapers in New York, and so it was, on May 1st, 1915, as Lusitania's boilers simmered away quietly and steam was gradually got up for the impending departure, that the New York Times ran that warning on page 19, sandwiched in between the notices for the anchor line and the new Stockbridge Hotel. Saturday morning. Lusitania lies alongside the Chelsea piers, all her coal aboard and the final cargoes being loaded. A steady stream of passengers crowd the gangways and sheds, passing inspections and customs. Before their eyes, the sheer hull of Lusitania rose up like the face of a huge steel cliff. She must have seemed so vast and so safe. The German embassy's warning had not gone totally unheeded. There'd actually been a few cancellations as the more nervous passengers had backed out, but those hundreds and hundreds who boarded the Lusitania on May 1st, 1915 had either missed the warning entirely or simply assumed that no civilized country would ever attack an unarmed merchant vessel carrying neutral passengers, especially not the Lusitania, a ship whose breakneck speeds were thought by most to make her virtually impervious to attack by a U-boat. Reporters flooded the dock that morning amidst the flurry of activity. Because of the newspaper warnings, this voyage in particular had drawn deep public interest and concern. Reporters even managed to corner Captain Turner, asking him his thoughts on the situation. He replied, "Do you think all of these people would be booking passage on board the Lusitania if they thought she could be caught by a German submarine? Why, it's the best joke I've heard in many days, this talk of torpedoing." He burst into a hearty laugh and added, "Germany can concentrate her entire fleet of submarines on our track, and we would elude them." To Turner, Lusitania was the ship used to cheating death. She had taken the Atlantic head-on and won. She had sped through the Atlantic dodging U-boats for months. His ship was the most suited to this important job, and he wouldn't have any suggestions to the contrary. News cameramen weren't so sure. One set up even on top of the Chelsea piers and began to roll his camera as Lusitania was backed out slowly past. Down on the docks, photographers snapped away for the newspapers and jokingly announced, to all within earshot, "We're going to call this one the Lusitania's last voyage." It was to be the liner's 202nd transatlantic trip, and tragically, the bad photographer's joke was going to prove prophetic. Lusitania departed New York 2 hours later than expected, and as she rounded Breezy Point and made for the open Atlantic, her passengers began to settle into their home for the next few days. Aboard the ship were around 1,960 people, below her maximum capacity, but impressively well booked for a wartime voyage. Even though it was wartime, her passenger list still featured a few luminaries and celebrities of the day. Chief among these was Alfred Vanderbilt, bound for Britain with his valet on business. The Vanderbilt family had established a railroad empire, and Alfred, even by age 37, had proved an adept businessman and real estate tycoon. He had apparently received a telegram from home which read, "Have it on definite authority that the Lusitania is to be torpedoed. You had better cancel passage immediately." He gave it no serious heed and boarded anyway to make the trip he'd made dozens of times before. Then there was Elbert Hubbard and his wife, Alice. Hubbard was a renowned writer and the eccentric founder of the Roycroft Arts and Crafts Society based in East Aurora, New York. When speaking to reporters after boarding Lusitania with Alice, Hubbard had said, "Speaking from a strictly personal point of view, I would not mind if they did sink the ship. It might be a good thing for me. I'd be a regular hero and go right to the bottom." Then, with some seriousness, he added, "I shall make no effort to get into the lifeboats unless there is some spare room." Also in first class travelled Mr. Isaac Lehman, a New York broker, bound for Europe and the lucrative wartime contracts there. He travelled everywhere with a small revolver, and this voyage would be no exception. Then there was Charles Frohman, legendary theatre manager and Broadway producer. He'd worked his way up from the very bottom to become one of the big players in entertainment on both sides of the Atlantic. Despite the bombastic industry he was in, Frohman was a reserved and private person. He was travelling to London to oversee a production which had so far been bombing at the box office, but his many friends were deeply concerned. One sent him a telegram which read, "I'll never forgive you if you get blown up by a submarine." It didn't deaden his spirits or his wicked wit. To one friend he said, "Al, if you want to write to me, just address the letter care of the German submarine U-4. Another friend saw him off from the quay as Lusitania departed. "Aren't you afraid of U-boats?" he had asked. Froman smiled. "No," he said, "I'm only afraid of the IOUs." Froman was joined by mentee actress Rita Jolivet, who'd acted in one of his shows. The pair had met a few familiar faces on board, actors, singers, and playwrights, who all rubbed elbows and would be firm dinner mates. As Froman and the others relaxed into the comfortable surrounds of the lounge and smoking rooms up in first class, and given the fact that first class was severely underbooked, at just over half capacity, there was plenty of space to do so. Beneath their feet, the 601 second-class passengers wandered through the ship in awe at her luxury. Avis Dolphin, 12, was one of dozens of children on board. She was travelling with 2 nurses to start school in Britain, and any excitement about travelling on one of the world's most famous ships was tempered by her terrible seasickness as the liner swayed and pitched gently around her. Chrissy Aitken was another young passenger in second class, just 16 years old. She was aboard with her family, including her father, James, older brother Jarvie, and his young 2-year-old son. The Aitkins were returning to their native Scotland after Jarvie's wife Grace had died unexpectedly the year before. Chrissy's own mother had passed away in 1908, so the bereaved family decided to return home. They'd originally booked passage aboard the Cunard Cameronia, but at the last minute the ship had been requisitioned by the Admiralty and they were transferred to the much larger Lusitania instead. Then there was Ian Holborn, a professor and lecturer. He had done a tour of the US trying to get a manuscript published and was returning to his home in Scotland. On an expedition to Iceland in 1900, he had fallen in love with a little Scottish isle he encountered along the way. He bought it first chance he got, and the locals treated him like a dignitary. He and his wife had eventually moved to London, with Holborn lecturing at colleges on classical history, poetry, and social matters. With the outbreak of war, he and his wife had moved back to their Scottish island, but then he had written his book, and he was keen to see it printed. His trip in America was a success, with the manuscript slated for publishing sometime the next year, and after a few months abroad, the 43-year-old was ready to come home to his wife and beloved island home. In third class, Lusitania's steerage held only 370 passengers, despite the fact she was designed to carry more than 1,100. Aside from the state of war, the simple truth was that the majority of people travelling aboard Lusitania that spring were mostly business people and middle class. The migrant trade was immensely popular in the years leading up to the war, but crossings going back the other way, back to Britain and Europe, were always quieter. These 370 men, women and children were mostly originally from Britain, Ireland or Europe, and they were heading back home either to stay with their families while the war played out, or to convince loved ones to come back with them to the safety of America. Lusitania's 4 propellers churned through the ocean, but she wasn't moving as fast as she normally would on an Atlantic crossing. If this fact was apparent to passengers on board, then it was painfully obvious to her captain, William Turner. Turner had been at sea since the tender age of 8, starting as a cabin boy on a sailing bark before moving his way from ship to ship, posting to posting, always in the hopes of one day commanding a vessel of his own. Once he joined the Cunard line in 1878, it took him 25 full years of dedicated service to finally see himself in command of a liner. Turner went on to skipper some of the most well-known Cunard liners like Carpathia, Mauretania, and then the newer Aquitania. Turner also knew Lusitania well. He'd been in command the night she'd copped a devastating rogue wave over her nose. He was a gruff old salt, a man known for his antisocial demeanour. Avoiding the usual social duties captains were expected to perform, and referring to his passengers once as a load of bloody monkeys who were constantly chattering. On one particular crossing aboard Mauretania, a female passenger asked Turner if she could remain on the bridge as the ship steamed down the Mersey out to open waters. Turner replied that it wasn't allowed. The passenger coyly pressed him by asking, "Well, what if a lady happened to insist?" But Turner simply replied flatly, "Madam, do you think that would be a lady?" He rarely joined his passengers for dinner and found the idea of small talk and mingling to be deeply upsetting, but humorously, passengers only seemed to enjoy his mystique, and it made him very popular. It helped that he was a fine captain too, and one of Cunard's most experienced men. With Lusitania on the wartime transatlantic service, he could leave the pleasantries to his staff captain and focus on the conduct of the ship under his command. The role of staff captain was a relatively new one. It had been introduced in the wake of the Titanic tragedy, when it was thought that ship's captains might have had too much on their plate in between running the vessel and associating with the passengers. James Jock Anderson, 48, was second in command of the ship and Turner's right-hand man. He'd been with Cunard for nearly 2 decades and had even held his own command with the company, but to serve in such a senior role aboard as famous a vessel as Lusitania was an honour. While Turner and his 6 other deck officers focused on navigation and the ship's progress, Anderson tended to the needs of the passengers and oversaw some of the more administration-heavy aspects of the ship's operation. It was not an easy job. Under he and Turner's watchful eye were around 690 men and women tasked with keeping the ship humming along. Down in the engine room, Chief Engineer Archibald Bryce and his men kept the turbines roaring and the ship's speed a steady constant. In the boiler rooms, more than 160 men, like leading fireman James Breen and David Evans, toiled to feed the furnaces tons of coal around the clock. Hurrying through the labyrinthine corridors, more than 100 stewards and stewardesses like John Valentine and Marion May Bird tended to passengers' every need, and in the enormous kitchens and galleys, dozens of cooks like Henry Beckett and George Wynne worked to feed hundreds of mouths. Lusitania was running like a well-oiled machine, a floating town. She may have had her happy peacetime funnel colours darkened, but she was still providing a service as good as a passenger might expect from any crossing during her heyday. The lounges sounded with happy chatter and laughter, shuffleboard weights rattled across the deck beams. Here was a happy reprieve from the terrible war news coming out of Europe, a self-contained world where all that seemed to exist was the rushing sea air, the rolling waves, and the gentle pitching of the mighty ship. For the roughly 1,260 passengers on board, life began to take on a simple, leisurely routine largely centered around dining times. On the surface, there seemed to be very little out of the ordinary, but to those familiar with Lusitania and the transatlantic crossing, there were signs that not all was as it seemed. They'd become accustomed to her flying across the ocean at cracking speeds, but this time they were surprised instead to find the ship ambling along at far below her top speed. This wouldn't do. Lusitania's speed was her best defense. Passengers weren't to know that for reasons of economy and shortages, the ship's speed had been greatly reduced. In fact, one of her cavernous boiler rooms had been closed entirely, its boilers sitting cold and unused. The fact was that Lusitania burnt through a monumental amount of coal that Cunard Line and the British Admiralty didn't have to spare. Instead, she would do this voyage far below her top speed. Aboard liners, it had become tradition that the run, or the number of miles covered over a 24-hour period, would be posted for passengers to see every morning. It even became a source of betting on board. But when details of the ship's run were posted the morning of the second day out of New York, it became clear that it would take a little bit longer than the passengers had hoped to see their way safely through the war zone. Many still held out hope that the crew was holding off on pushing Lusitania's engines until the ship was closer to the war zone itself, but each time the ship's run was posted, Lusitania could never seem to break an average of 21 knots. This was still a good clip. In fact, it was the top speed of most British liners serving as troop ships and auxiliary cruisers at the time, but still, it began to create an air of anxiety on board. Isaac Lehman, the New York broker, caught up to the ship's first officer and challenged him on Lusitania's slow progress. He was told, erroneously, that it was thanks to crew shortages. The mood of unease pervaded the entire ship. At night, passengers slept fully clothed or with lifeboats at arm's reach. Some slept in the public rooms high up in the ship for fear of being caught far below in their staterooms and drowned. It was said that one man even snuck into a lifeboat to sleep there. Captain Turner and his officers reassured passengers as best they could that all was well, but hundreds of overactive imaginations saw a periscope behind every wave, a torpedo strike at every moment. Their worry was not baseless. The Atlantic Ocean was not a friendly place. Hundreds of miles away, off the coast of Ireland, a submarine motored ahead and slipped through the ocean waves like some kind of giant grey metal dagger. The day Lusitania had departed New York, the submarine had been patrolling off the coast of Ireland. Now, its commander, Walter Schwieger, was beginning to feel lucky. Under his command, the U-20 had been responsible for sinking 6 British vessels since the beginning of his patrol in January. but the pace had quickly picked up since the declaration of the war zone encircling the British Isles. They were in an ideal position to patrol the busy waterways leading to crucial ports like Liverpool. On the 5th, 4 days after Lusitania had left, U-20 caught and sank a small fishing boat off the coast of Ireland. The next day, a 2,000-ton steamship. Schwieger had been a U-boat man since 1911, and he had begun to form the reputation as something of a renegade. Earlier that same patrol, Schwieger had attacked a hospital ship, HMHS Asturias. The torpedo hit, but it failed to detonate. The German embassy announced the attack had been a mistake, and that Schwieger had disengaged afterward, but it was clear that he had no qualms with attacking British ships, military or civilian. He knew the waters off Ireland would bring many targets his way. He probably also knew Lusitania was to be expected off this stretch of coast as she maintained her regular schedule. From the conning tower, U-20's men peered at the horizon with their binoculars, looking for the telltale sign of smoke. All they had to do was wait. Aboard Lusitania, a lifeboat drill was held, largely for the benefit of crew. The passengers were not impressed. George Kessler, a wine merchant travelling in first class, approached Captain Turner himself and suggested passengers should also receive a drill and tickets with designated lifeboat numbers. Turner brushed him off, and that was the end of it. The demonstration did very little to quell the nervous travellers, whose trepidation only grew as the ship inched closer and closer to the war zone. The passengers weren't the only ones concerned by the Lusitania's precarious position. During the voyage, Alfred Booth, the chairman of Cunard Line, appealed to the British Admiralty themselves to ensure all precautions were in place to ensure the safe passage of the liner. Multiple warnings had been sent via telegram to all inbound ships crossing through the war zone, with 2 in particular meant for Lusitania specifically. The messages were very clear. Increased submarine activity had been detected in the waters off Ireland, and any inbound ships were urged to take extra precautions. Captains were advised, but not ordered, to maintain full speed and a mid-channel course, avoiding coastlines and, where possible, making a zigzag course that would confuse submarines trying to get a bearing on their target. Turner knew these waters and his ship very well, and he had ultimate authority on board. He kept that advice in mind, but trusted his own instinct. Soon, his ship would be off Ireland and the familiar coastline would be in sight. It would guide him and his ship home. Still, he decided to take some precautions. Early in the afternoon of the 6th, the final day before Lusitania made landfall, he ordered 22 of the ship's boats uncovered and swung out, ready for launching at a moment's notice. As Lusitania headed into her final night, the ship was alive with activity. In first class, parties were held by the more illustrious passengers in their cabins, and in the lounge, a seamen's charity concert was held, a tradition in the Cunard and other lines for the final night of a ship's voyage. Passengers mustered the courage to get on stage and perform, singing, juggling, joking. It was all on display, and laughter filled the air despite the general feeling of unease. First-class passenger and actress Rita Jolivet declined to perform, along with the other show business talent. At intermission, there was a stark reminder of the situation. Turner got up on stage to relay the latest news. "On entering the war zone tomorrow," he said, "we shall be securely in the care of the Royal Navy, and of course, there is no need for alarm." He reminded passengers not to light cigarettes on deck, and then he let the show go on. Turner was built like a barrel. He was gruff, but in an authoritative way. It gave him an air of absolute certainty. He had even swung the boats out, so passengers knew he was taking the threat seriously. All of this put many minds at ease, but just shortly after, a message came through on the telegraph that read, "To all British ships, take Liverpool pilot at bar and avoid headlands. Pass harbours at full speed. Steer mid-channel course. Submarines off Fastnet." As the hours grew later, Captain Turner ordered a blackout. All outboard lights on the ship were extinguished, all portholes and skylights were covered. Lusitania would steam through the night under the cover of blackness, and her captain stayed up until daybreak to peer into the inky horizon. This would be Lusitania's final night. Early the next morning, Lusitania was approaching Ireland, about 100 miles west-southwest of the coast, when she had to slow down yet again. Turner was being especially cautious, navigating Lusitania through a thick, murky fog. Her speed had been at the maximum allowed, 21 knots, but now it had fallen off significantly. Despite having officially crossed over into the patch of sea designated by Germany as an unrestricted war zone, Turner didn't want to run the risk of colliding with another vessel in the fog. Lusitania lumbered along at 18 and then just 15 knots, her foghorn booming out into the mist. Margaret Mackworth, a first-class passenger and notable suffragette, was travelling with her father, and the two were at lunch. "Home tomorrow," she had said. "Aren't you pleased, father?" "I would be more pleased, my dear," he replied, "if I believed that wretched siren hasn't given our whereabouts away." He wasn't alone in thinking so. Many passengers were alarmed that Lusitania would advertise her position like this, but Turner was no fool. A ship cloaked in fog is essentially invisible to a submarine. The hours ticked by, and by 10 a.m. the blanket of fog at last lifted to reveal, far off in the distance, the Irish coast and a bright, beautiful sun. Land was in sight, and for a moment it seemed that maybe, just maybe, they were in the clear. On the bridge, Captain Turner had decisions to make. Warnings had been coming in from the British Admiralty via wireless every hour on the hour throughout the night. He had Lusitania on a straight course, headed right towards the Irish coast, rather than remaining far out to sea. The Admiralty had advised against this, and recommended that he make some kind of zigzag course, but it presented him with problems. The course he maintained was carefully planned to bring Lusitania into Liverpool at high tide, making it much quicker to pick up the harbour pilot, who would be waiting there and then proceed toward the dock without stopping. If they came in too early, it would make the ship a sitting duck. But to make it to the Mersey Bar at high tide at all, the ship would be unable to make a zigzag course, and instead needed to make straight for land. Essentially, everything he'd been warned specifically not to do. The latest warning to come in from the Admiralty gave him pause. Submarines 5 miles south of Cape Clear proceeding west when sighted at 10 a.m. If this was true, by Turner's reckoning, Lusitania had somehow skirted the U-boats without realising, having already passed Cape Clear in the cover of the fog. The horrifying truth was that since the day of Lusitania's departure less than a week prior, some 23 vessels had been torpedoed in the very waters through which the liner now sailed. At 1:20 p.m, U-20 was motoring on the surface, maintaining her usual watchful patrol when smoke was spotted on the horizon. Schwieger entered into the U-boat's log, ahead and to starboard 4 funnels and 2 masts of a steamer, with course triangular to us, comes into sight. Ship is made out to be a large passenger steamer. He knew that there was only one liner it could possibly be. On Lusitania, no one could have asked for finer weather. Passengers gathered on the decks to take in the scenery of the Irish coastline, participate in deck games, or simply stretch out in deck chairs to read and enjoy this final stretch of their voyage. Belle Nash, who'd been caring for her seasick husband Theodore, stepped away for a few moments and took in the sights. "A lovelier day cannot be imagined," she later said. The air was warm, no wind, bright sun, smooth sea. They were very nearly home. On the bridge, Turner was beginning to realise his plan of reaching Mersey Bar at high tide could very well be flawed. At his current speed, Lusitania would steam into Liverpool far too early to meet the tide, meaning she would need to wait it out in the Irish Sea, her billowing smoke visible for miles around. In order to prevent this, the first task was to determine the ship's exact location relative to the shore, since, thanks to the fog, it wasn't fully yet clear. Turner ordered a 4-point bearing, a procedure used by seafarers to pinpoint their position by remaining on the same dead-straight course for a total of 40 minutes while the ship's position was marked relative to a stationary object, in this case, the old head of Kinsale. There rose from there a tall, black-and-white lighthouse that looked out over the sea. After taking 4 of these bearings, Turner would be able to determine their exact position. After this, he hoped to set a course to arrive in Liverpool the next morning. He ordered the ship make a turn to starboard so that the first officer could begin collecting the first of the bearings. Passengers watched with some disappointment as the lush Irish coastline drifted out of view. The ship's bow now pointed towards the open ocean again. Many assumed Turner was beginning to zigzag the ship to avoid detection by U-boats, but no one on board could have known that this simple manoeuvre had just done the exact opposite. Lusitania's fate was sealed. Aboard U-20, Captain Schwieger stood amazed. The unmistakable form of the great British liner RMS Lusitania had now changed course and landed herself directly in his crosshairs. She could not have steered, he said, a more perfect course if she had deliberately tried to give us a dead shot. For the next 25 minutes, the U-boat secretly gave chase. The liner came nearer and nearer, with no escorts in sight, no change in course, and no lookouts catching sight of the submarine's periscope. If Schwieger was ever handed a golden opportunity in his life, it was right now, and he was not keen to let it slip away. He ordered a single G6 torpedo armed and the tube made ready. U-20 inched her way closer and closer to her target, and finally, upon coming within a half-mile of the grand and powerful Cunard at 2:10 p.m, Schwieger gave the order to fire. In the dining saloons, the second lunch sitting had been served and now coffee and tea were being poured out. On deck, passengers strolled and smoked cigars. Seaman Leslie Morton was scanning the waters off Lusitania's starboard bow. His eyes had been playing tricks on him that day, and he'd been seeing disturbances in the water where there weren't any. He kept his eyes trained on the sea ahead when, suddenly, an unmistakable track of white foam began streaking its way towards the liner. Morton's eyes widened. He fumbled for his megaphone and bellowed, "Torpedoes coming on the starboard side." Second Officer Hefford repeated the warning to Captain Turner, but there was no time to respond. In just 35 seconds, the torpedo met its mark. For the briefest of moments, silence hung in the air. There was a fleeting, almost imperceptible pause between the torpedo striking the ship and all hell breaking loose. Captain Turner took one step toward the starboard bridge wing, and in that moment 350 pounds of explosives ripped through Lusitania's hull like tissue paper. Shrapnel, debris and sea spray rained from the sky in a massive geyser onto the decks below. The spray and the force of the explosion had lifted one of Lusitania's 5-ton lifeboats clean into the air as if it was a toy. Down below the waterline, the hexanite warhead had left a hole in the ship's side some 40 feet wide. The ocean roared in, flooding her coal bunkers and boiler room 1, rushing in at some 100 tons per second. It was so much that Lusitania suddenly listed hard over to starboard. It caught many off guard and swept them off their feet. In the dining saloon, Professor Ian Holborn had been at lunch and watched as dishes crashed to the floor while Lusitania lurched. Amazingly, in some parts of the ship, there was absolute calm. The passengers simply got up and made for the stairs to the boat deck. The days of anxiety had meant that many of Lusitania's passengers were resigned to the idea that their ship would be hit, and now the expected had simply happened. Elsewhere, closer to the blast, there was a rush to get topside. In the immediate wake of the torpedo strike, Captain Turner knew he needed to make a move, and fast. He had scarcely regained his bearings though when a second, deep explosion rattled the vessel under his feet. Had it been another strike? When Turner once again regained his composure, he noticed that the old head of Kinsale was off to starboard, seemingly just close enough to make him consider making a run to beach his vessel. It was a gamble, but maybe, just maybe, they could make it. The impact of the torpedo had caused immense damage to the ship's starboard bow, but passengers far enough away in the stern section only reported hearing a dull thud. One passenger, designer Oliver Bernard, thought to himself, well, that wasn't so bad. At the same time, passengers who'd been swept off their feet and thrown into the bulkheads by the blast were coming to terms. It seemed as if she were going down at once, said bookseller Charles Laureate, but then she stopped suddenly as if the sea had met the watertight bulkheads, and she seemed to right herself and even raise her bow a little. This gave me a feeling of security, and I at first thought that she would stay afloat. But then, that second explosion was heard from deep within the belly of the ship. Charles Laureate described it as very muffled, more like an explosion of a boiler. Any complacency was violently shaken out of passengers as the ship began to take on a heavier list, from 15 degrees that quickly rose towards 20. Margaret Mackworth, having just finished lunch with her father, heard the explosions and rushed to her cabin to retrieve life jackets for the two of them. After wasting a minute or so making polite apologies, after almost running into a stewardess, she made her way up to the boat deck and met her friend Dorothy Connor. The two looked around at the chaos surrounding them, and after a moment, Margaret remarked, "I always thought a shipwreck was a well-organised affair." Dorothy replied, "Well, so did I, but I've learned a devil of a lot in the last 5 minutes." Down in the main stairs leading to the boat decks, a dense crowd blocked the exits as dozens of people all rushed for the boat deck at the same time. The ship's electric lifts were one of her most modern and impressive features. It seems likely that passengers, fed up with the crush and worried to get up on the boat deck as soon as possible, took over the lifts for themselves and began to make for the deck. Up on the bridge, Turner kept his sights on the old head of Kinsale as he ordered the helm put hard over, veering from his straight course to one headed right for the coast. But then his ship began to overcorrect, turning to port, and Turner ordered the helm to starboard, but the helm and the telegraphs failed to respond. In all likelihood, the second explosion he'd heard had been the bursting and rupturing of steam pipes deep down in the ship's bowels. Lusitania's mighty power plant was failing. She traced a wide, slow circle through the ocean. Marconi operator Robert Leith was also realising he was running out of time the moment the ship's lights began to flicker. He raced to the Marconi room, praying the power held out, and quickly tapped out, "Come at once, big list, 10 miles south, old head of Kinsale." Turner soon realised that he would not be able to beach his ship. He had ordered the watertight doors closed and the lifeboats swung out to the rails, but now he was faced with another issue. The ship was still making around 18 knots from momentum alone. It was too dangerous to launch any boats until she had been stopped, and with the reversing turbines unresponsive, it was now up to the sea to slow her. Lusitania continued forward with no way to control her course or reduce her speed. That forward motion of the ship caused only more water to roar in through the gaping hole left in her side. Her bow dipped lower, her list grew more severe. The clock was ticking. Precious minutes slipped away as passengers began to assemble on deck, clamouring for information. No one knew the extent of the damage or if the ship had been mortally wounded. One woman approached Captain Turner directly, asking, "What do you wish for us to do?" The captain replied, "Stay right where you are, madam, she's all right." The woman was not satisfied. "Where do you get your information?" Turner responded, "From the engine room, madam." But Turner certainly knew things were far from all right, and if the engine room had told him anything, it couldn't be reassuring. His focus now was on crowd control, ensuring chaos didn't ensue in a mad dash for the lifeboats. The reassuring words of the captain spread among some of the passengers, who were at first relieved to hear the good news. Cheers were even heard among those who'd been waiting by the lifeboats, and the crowd began to thin. Many passengers simply wanted to go back to enjoying the splendid weather. Of course, the Lusitania couldn't be in real danger, they reckoned. She'd been engineered with all the safety and strength you could ever need. But then, there came a sure sign of impending doom. Lusitania's lights gave out as her power completely died, her steam pressure gone. The outside of the ship was bathed in brilliant sunshine, but the inside now became a maze of corridors cloaked in darkness. Those who had relied on the ship's electric lifts to take them up to the boat deck were now trapped, with their lift cars stuck between two decks. Water began to rush in through dozens of open portholes throughout the ship at a rate of 260 tons per minute. Up on the boat deck, passengers and crew had waited about 10 minutes since the torpedo strike for the ship to lose her momentum. Now that her speed was no longer an issue, the boats could at last be got away, a much larger problem loomed. Lusitania's list to starboard had become so severe that her starboard lifeboats now hung far outboard, precariously swaying over the sea, while the lifeboats on the other side had swung inward so far that they were virtually unable to be launched without bumping their way down the ship's hull. Those that decided to take their chances on the starboard boats were faced with the paralysing notion of jumping into a lifeboat swinging as much as 8 feet away from the edge of the deck, with the ocean some 6 stories beneath them. Some officers used deck chairs as a bridge to help passengers into the boats, but many opted to take a leap of faith. On the port side, Staff Captain Jock Anderson was doing his best to reassure the passengers and crew as they struggled to swing the boats out against the list of the ship. He saw how precarious an attempt would be at launching. He ordered all the women and children who'd boarded some of the boats already to get out. Then there was a dull boom as some of the machinery astride the third funnel, possibly one or more of the thermotanks that moderated air temperature within the ship, detonated with a rush of steam and smoke. The third funnel, 5 or 6 stories tall, was knocked out of true and canted ominously over. The shrouds and stays which connected it to the deck held taut, but frightened passengers got the impression it could topple at any minute. The situation on the port side of the ship was dire. Lifted high into the air by the list, the danger was less apparent than on the other side, where the ocean now seemed just feet away. Despite Anderson's efforts, crewmen had managed to load and lower portside boats as concern began to mount among the passengers. Boat 12 was being lowered when it was rushed by passengers and one end broke free of its falls. It dropped and dumped its human cargo into the ocean before the remaining falls snapped and it slammed down on top of them. Boat 8 struggled down the ship's hull, bumping and grinding along the rivet heads and plates the whole way before it finally snagged, broke free from its lines and smashed into the ocean with its entire complement of passengers. Survivors came up gasping for air, but then, from far above them, there came another crashing sound and screams. Lifeboat 10 had suffered the same fate, but now it and its occupants came crashing down onto the heads of Boat 8's people still in the water. Meanwhile, boat number 20 was being loaded when first-class passenger and businessman Ogden Hammond and his wife Mary came across a crowd waiting to board. At first, they were hesitant to step in, but once the boat had filled up, the Hammonds finally boarded and it began to lower away. The boat lowered steadily at first until the sailor manning the falls at the bow lost control of his line. Ogden attempted to take hold of it, but it slipped through his hands fast enough to tear the skin from his palms. The boat dove forward, spilling all of its passengers 60 feet into the sea below. Mary did not resurface. Lusitania's nameplate had once towered proudly over the Atlantic, but now it was submerged as the ship's bow began to plunge towards the seafloor. On the starboard side, the same list which had swung the portside lifeboats in was causing the starboard boats to swing further out. Lifeboat 17 was filling up quickly with passengers, and third-class passenger Elizabeth Duckworth had just got her friend Alice Scott's son away in another boat, but there wasn't room for the two women to join him. Instead, they climbed into boat 17. They were joined by Professor Ian Holborn. On the voyage, he had befriended 12-year-old Avis Dolphin and helped her overcome her crippling seasickness. He saw to it that she and the two nurses she was travelling with were put safely into the boat, telling Avis to find his wife and children and kiss them goodbye for him. 17 began to be lowered away, and at first all seemed well, but then the crew had trouble with the boat's launching tackle. Elizabeth Duckworth got spooked, and at the last second she jumped out of the boat and back onto the deck. The lifeboat lowered away, but just before it reached the water, it capsized and spilled its entire complement out into the ocean. Many couldn't swim, and they were dragged down by the weight of their heavy woolen clothes. Professor Holborn had watched in horror. Then, without thinking, he dived into the ocean to try to get to Avis. Commander Schwieger watched the disaster play out. It seemed even he was shocked at the chaos and carnage they had unleashed, saying, "It was the most terrible sight I've ever seen. It was impossible for me to give any help. I could only have saved a handful." Assuming a nearby cruiser would be along to assist the foundering liner, Schwieger gave the order to dive his submarine and withdraw. With one single torpedo, he had sunk more tonnage than he had for the rest of U-20's patrol combined. The mood inside the submarine was jubilant, despite the death toll climbing by the minute nearby. At 2:25 p.m, Schwieger entered into his log, "It would have been impossible for me anyhow to fire a second torpedo into this crushing crowd of humanity trying to save their lives." Some passengers reported U-20's crew actually watched the events unfold from the surface, their men lining the deck as the liner died. In the end, Schwieger knew he and his men could do little to help. The submarine U-20 left the scene of devastation behind her. Back on Lusitania, the ship had assumed a 25-degree list to starboard, and for those in the wheelhouse, there was no more question as to Lusitania's fate. Marconi operator Leith, working at the wireless set using an emergency dynamo, tapped out again and again his desperate cries for help. The sharp tilt of the ship made it impossible to accurately tap out his messages, but finally his desperation reached its peak and he simply sent, "Send help quickly, I'm listing badly." As the ship continued to list, it became clear he had done all he could do. Rising from his swivel chair, balancing half on the bulkhead on his knees, he took out his camera, snapping a photo of the ship looking towards a submerged bow. "What a snap this will make," he commented to Oliver Bernard, who was nearby, and he, Bernard, along with the chief electrician Hutchinson, then made their way down the starboard railing and headed for a lifeboat floating nearby. Somehow, in the chaos and the confusion, some lifeboats got away. On the starboard side, boats 1 and then 13 had been lowered. Remarkably, one portside boat, 14, was even successfully launched against the list, but the drainage hole designed to let rainwater out hadn't been plugged. The boat was swamped and capsized. Meanwhile, bookseller Charles Laureate had become keenly aware of the real and present danger he was in. After emerging from his cabin to retrieve his life jacket in complete darkness, the ship's list forced him to walk partly on the wall. Laureate emerged on the boat deck and made his way to boat 7 on the ship's starboard side. The sea was rapidly rising to the level of the lifeboat, which was already filled with women and children. Laureate and a steward set about attempting to free the boat, with one man working to cut through the tethers on each end. Lusitania's massive funnels loomed overhead, inching closer and closer with each degree of list. After fumbling to release the boat, it was clear the ship was sinking too quickly. Laureate abandoned the lifeboat and pleaded with the other passengers to follow him, but most felt they were safer in the lifeboat than in the open ocean, and he watched with horror as the lifeboat was dragged underwater, taking with it most of the women and children who had hoped by entering the lifeboat that they'd be spared. Seaman Leslie Morton was scrambling to help launch as many lifeboats as possible. Lusitania was by then listing a full 30 degrees to starboard, and he knew they were all quickly running out of time. He set about helping passengers across the gap between the ship and boat 9, and a total of 60 people managed to make the leap. Mabel Learoyd, along with her husband Charles, attempted to board the lifeboat, but doing so would be no easy task. Thanks to the ship's heavy list, they needed to rush into the boat, while also clinging onto the vessel's railing, tumbling more than stepping aboard. The boat immediately began to be lowered, but in that same moment, panic ensued. Leslie Morton and a petty officer managed to lower boat 9 into the sea, but just as it hit the surface, Morton noticed the men lowering the next boat aft, but quickly the process was going awry. Before Morton could react, the men lost control of the falls, and lifeboat 11 dropped 30 feet to land directly on top of boat 9. The boat's passengers spilled into the sea, and Mabel Learoyd and her husband were separated underwater. Mabel surfaced, confused, disoriented, and desperately searching for Charles, but he was nowhere to be seen. Morton looked on appalled. There was no time to dive in and attempt a valiant rescue. Instead, he rushed to another boat and found his brother. The two men worked to lower it away as quickly as possible. But once the boat hit the water, passengers began clinging onto whatever parts of the ship that they could, from rails to ropes, believing in their panic that they were safer hanging onto the sinking ship than floating off in a lifeboat. Morton noticed the boat begin to tip inward towards Lusitania's hull, and he realised too late that the gunwale of the boat had got snagged on the ship. There was no time to try to right it. Both brothers decided to jump into the sea, into that swirling chaos of debris and bodies, and when Morton surfaced, he suddenly remembered his brother never knew how to swim. As he looked up to see the massive liner begin to take her last violent gasps, he knew there was no time left. He began to swim as hard as he could away from the ship. But for one brief moment, he stopped and stole a final glance at the sinking ship, with Captain Turner still on the bridge, the ocean rising to meet him. Panic was beginning to spread as more passengers started to realise that time was running out. Boat 18, now high up on the port side, was being loaded with passengers, but the sailor in charge of the boat was waiting for direct orders before lowering. Isaac Lehman, the stockbroker, armed with his revolver, was not about to wait for formalities. The sailor told him yet again that the captain had ordered no boats launched yet, and Lehman, it seemed, reached his breaking point. "To hell with the captain," he roared. "Don't you see this boat is sinking?" In desperation, he then drew his weapon on the sailor. "The first man that disobeys my order to launch this boat," he said, "I shoot to kill." Fearing for his life, the sailor knocked out the lifeboat's restraining pin with an axe, and the lifeboat, already under the influence of the ship's list and now carrying the weight of its entire load of passengers, swung wildly inward, its 5-ton weight smashed straight into a small group of passengers who'd been waiting to board. Charles Laureate, having narrowly escaped disaster during a failed lifeboat launch, was now swimming for his life away from the ship. He turned back around and looked at the horrific scene playing out before him. Lusitania was now completely down by the head, with her stern rising high into the air, the entire ship twisted unnaturally toward the starboard side. The passengers, who resolved to stay on the ship, held on for dear life, clustering against the railings, some climbing higher towards the stern, if only to delay the inevitable. Third Officer Bestick described the ship making a peculiar lurching movement as a massive wave rolled up the boat deck and swept away anything and everything in its path. Laureate described hearing a gut-wrenching wail as the sea continued its violent rampage. All the despair, terror, and anguish, he said, of hundreds of souls passing into eternity composed that awful cry. As the ship's final moments approached, crew worked furiously to free and lower boats 17 and, all the way at the stern of the ship, 21. But 17 was now directly in the path of funnel number 3, which loomed ominously overhead, and boat 21 was being lifted up perversely high into the air. Water raged through the entirety of Lusitania's interior, momentarily righting her severe list to a mere 5 degrees. Violent explosions could be heard from deep within the hull as the influx of water tore through the ship's interiors. Glassware shattered, machinery gave way, and everything within the vessel began to groan and scream as it was virtually gutted by the force of the sea. Just as quickly as she evened out, she began to plunge. First-class passenger Dwight Harris said that she plunged forward like a knife blade into the water, funnels, masts, boats, all breaking to pieces and falling about everywhere. Those left aboard began to instinctively run for higher ground. Lusitania's stern now rose high out of the water, and her 4 gleaming bronze propellers pointed towards the sky. Passengers swarmed atop the tall second-class deckhouse, which towered above the ship's stern. Here were the lifeboats 21 and 22. 22 was left in place. Lowering against the list of the ship was a clear impossibility, but 21 was filled and lowered away as the ship's stern swung wildly through the air, and somehow it survived its wild flight and got away safely as the dying ship began to slide under for good. Lusitania was 787 feet, or 240 metres long, but the stretch of water she was sinking in was only 93 metres, or 300 or so feet deep. From far below there came a deep, grinding boom and a groan as the ship's great bow, hundreds of feet underwater, struck the sea floor with a crunch. The bow plates twisted and buckled, and the ship began to drop like a stone. Slowly, the deck houses, the ornate public rooms, they were all consumed by boiling white water. At the Veranda Cafe, actress Rita Jolivet was holding onto the railing with producer Charles Frohman when the surging ocean rose to meet them. Rita described it as a green cliff of water. The group was separated, and Rita pulled down violently, so violently that her tightly laced boots were pulled right off of her feet. She rose up, but she was pulled under again by the suction. Again and again she struggled to break the surface. The story was the same for Isaac Lehman. He was clinging onto the railing, his foot a damaged mess. He'd threatened the crew working at Lifeboat 18 when it swung inboard and crushed passengers nearby, but it had also crushed his leg. Seawater roared over the deckhouse behind him and pulled him under, but somehow he and Rita both came up to the surface for good and watched on as Lusitania began to drop straight down. Charles Laureate had narrowly escaped being pulled down by Lifeboat 7, but now there was another danger headed his way. The wireless antenna, strung between the ship's masts and usually 180 feet or 55 metres clear above the waterline, now slapped down into the ocean around him. Some in the water were hit by the heavy steel cables, and Laureate felt them clip his shoulder and spin him around upside down. He struggled for his life, and he broke free, bursting to the surface again and swimming for a lifeboat. Laureate wasn't the only one hit as the ship went down. Lifeboat 15's launch had been left to the absolute last second. The boat was washed bodily across the boat deck and straight into the support cables for funnel number 3. As the ship sank around them, the huge funnel loomed overhead, and many in the boat thought it was going to crush them. A few jumped into the water to swim away, but then, at the last second, Lusitania seemed to roll away from them and boat 15 was freed. Seconds later, the towering funnels began to be dragged below the surface, still attached to the ship. They were empty inside and created a huge suction. Those who jumped out of boat 15 and any others unfortunate enough to be close by were pulled in by a maelstrom into the funnel tops and dragged down below. 26-year-old Margaret Guire was one of those pulled down, dragged deep inside, thinking the end was near, when at last a huge pocket of air burst from the bowels of the ship and blasted her and 2 other passengers nearby to the surface, coughing and covered in soot. With a mighty roar, funnel number 3, which had been somehow blasted off of its base, at last came down into the water with a huge splash. Lusitania's boats had presented a deadly chaos. Ironically, those who stayed behind at the ship's stern had the gentlest escape. They simply stepped off and into the water as it rose to meet them. The second-class deckhouse tower was finally engulfed, and then the fantail dropped. As it did, lifeboat 22 on the port side was picked up by the water and broke free from its lines, upside down. Passengers rushed to climb on top. Lusitania did not slide quietly and gracefully beneath the waves, rather an upheaval followed her, described as a great swirling greenish-white bubble rising from the surface, spewing debris, wreckage, and people in all directions. The final, lingering moan came from the ship before she would go silent forever. It had been just 18 minutes since the torpedo had struck, and Lusitania was gone. What was left was a horrifying scene of chaos and desperation, with many survivors left praying for rescue while clinging to debris and floating in a mass of wreckage. Only 6 of Lusitania's boats had been successfully launched out of the 22 she had set sail with. Her speed had not saved her, nor had her watertight compartments or the strength of her hull. She had proved just as sinkable as Titanic did 3 years prior. For the survivors clinging to life adrift in the ocean, their worst fears had become a terrifying reality, but now it was all over. The worst had occurred. There was nothing to do but wait. The Irish coast was painfully visible, but clearly not within swimming distance. The water at 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 Celsius was still cold enough to induce hypothermia. Many of those who had watched Lusitania's final plunge from the water wouldn't make it long enough to be rescued, ultimately succumbing to the cold. The water was peppered with bodies which needed to be pushed aside in order for survivors to reach boats. Overhead, seagulls wheeled and called. The sun still beat down. The survivors struggled for life and waited for help. On land, word had already begun to spread of Lusitania's tragic demise, and Admiral Charles Henry Coke, a senior naval officer in Queenstown, Ireland, first heard word of the sinking just after 2:30 p.m. Immediately, he set about arranging for rescue, calling up every vessel at his disposal to rush to Lusitania's last known position. Among those rescue craft was the warship HMS Juno, the fastest ship at hand. She'd be able to make it to the wreck site in just about an hour, making 18 knots. Admiral Coke sent a message advising the Admiralty of Juno's dispatch, but he quickly received a clear, 3-word reply: urgent, recall Juno. Since no one could be sure whether or not the submarine was still lurking, Juno was ordered back to port. It would be 3 full hours before the survivors would see rescue when a ragtag group of small trawlers and fishing boats arrived on scene. They darted in between groups of people clinging onto wreckage, upturned boats and collapsible rafts. Collectively, they rescued a total of 763 survivors of the ship's original 1,960 people and bore them to Queenstown in the late night hours of May 7th. days following the loss of Lusitania were filled with confusion, grief, and shock. Telegrams flooded in, informing families of the loss of their loved ones, but not every telegram was accurate. Many passengers who were reported to be alive had in fact perished in the disaster, with the families and friends left to find out the awful truth only days later. Cunard found it difficult to keep up with the influx of telegrams coming into their offices from anxious families, and moreover, they could do little to help. Communication was sluggish, details were murky, and some 600 souls remained unaccounted for after the disaster. They simply had no information to give. Families flocked to the Cunard offices on both sides of the Atlantic, desperate for any news at all. Lusitania was carrying many noted passengers whose stories are well known, but there were hundreds of lesser-known tragedies that had played out in the 18 minutes in which the ship had sunk. Soon, it became clear that whole families had been lost. Little Helen Smith was found in the water and rescued. She had been travelling with her family, father, Alfred, mother Elizabeth, brother Hubert, an aunt, and 2 cousins, but she was the only survivor. William and Sarah Hodges, travelling with their 2 sons, Dean and William, they were all lost. So too the Crumpton family, Paul and Gladys, and their 6 children and a nurse, all gone. Edward Williams, 10, had been aboard Lusitania with his mother and 5 siblings. Only he and his sister Edith survived. But amongst the carnage, there were stories of heroism and selflessness. Professor Ian Holborn had watched in horror as little Avis Dolphin's boat had been overturned. He dived in after her but became tangled in ropes and nearly drowned himself. Separated from his young friend, he had found refuge in another boat and watched Lusitania go under. He reached Queenstown, exhausted and suffering from exposure and the cold, but he continued to search as best he could. And finally, at rest in a hotel, he received a visitor. It was Avis. She had survived. For the following weeks and months, bodies washed up on the Irish shore, only to be taken away to makeshift morgues for identification. Families walked through the rows of dead, looking for loved ones, familiar faces. 140 were never claimed. They were laid to rest in a mass burial at the Old Church Cemetery outside of Queenstown. A funeral service was held for the dozens of men, women and children whose identities remained unknown, and crowds of people thronged to pay their respects. Lusitania had begun her life in triumph. She had carried hundreds of thousands in happiness and comfort, but now she was at the bottom of the ocean, a bent and broken husk, and all that remained were dozens of wooden coffins. The crowd sang the hymn, "Abide with me," and final words and prayers were read. The unknown dead of the Lusitania were committed to the earth, and the entire world seemed to bow its head in reverence.